3 children ran across a ballroom full of doctors, donors, and people in suits that cost more than my car. They weren't running toward the stage. They weren't running toward the doctors who had saved their lives. They were running toward me, and they were calling a name that wasn't mine. My name is Daniel. I drive a taxi for a living. My wife treats children with cancer. This is what happened on the night someone finally said my name out loud in a room full of people, and why my wife was already crying before anyone else understood what they were seeing. I drive a taxi for a living. My wife treats children with cancer every Thursday. She has been doing it for 9 years. I disappear for 3 hours. I never told her where I go, but somehow, years ago, she discovered it on her own. After that, she never asked me about it again. Then one night, during a major charity gala for children with cancer, 3 little children came running across a ballroom packed with donors, doctors, and guests. They shouted a name, but it wasn't my real name. That name meant nothing to anyone else in the room. To those children, it meant everything. My name is Daniel. My wife's name is Lucia. She has never acted as if her job made her better than me, and I have never acted as if mine made me less important. I make her breakfast before her long surgeries. She stays awake waiting. For me, when my taxi shifts run late into the night, we are equals, even though our professions are completely different. She says she fell in love with me on our first date, and it wasn't because of anything I said. We had just left a small restaurant when a little girl dropped her ice cream onto the sidewalk. She burst into tears right there on the corner. I didn't even think about it. I went back inside the restaurant and bought her another one before returning to our table. Lucia still remembers it from time to tea. You didn't even finish your sentence, she tells me. You just got up. She says that in those exact 30 seconds, she knew she wanted to marry me. I didn't propose to her until 2 years later. She says she had already made that decision long before. Once, she told me something I never forgot. I cure children at the hospital. You cure them when you remind them how to smile again. She never asks me what I do every Thursday afternoon, not because she doesn't care. A long time ago, one Thursday, she finished a surgery earlier than expected and went looking for me. She saw me on the pediatric floor reading a pirate story to a child who had a tube connected to his arm. She never told me she had seen me. She simply started saying goodbye to me a little differently from that day on. She just kisses me and says, "See you after your Thursday." That's it. No questions. Her hospital colleagues don't know that she's married to the man who appears there every week. She has never told them, not because she's embarrassed by me. She simply never believed that story was hers to tell. The cancer. Charity invited Lucia to its annual gala. Every year, they give awards to doctors and donors. She asked me to go with her. I wasn't very convinced. I only have one suit, and it's already seen better days. She smiled. I didn't marry your wardrobe. There was nowhere to park near the building, so I drove her there in my own taxi. That small decision was the one that changed everything. We stopped in front of the entrance. A line of luxury cars gleamed beneath the spotlights. From inside, I could already hear a string quartet playing while waiters moved through the ballroom carrying trays of champagne glasses. Lucia got out first. Her dress sparkled. The camera flashes started going off immediately. I walked around the taxi to park. I passed men wearing suits that probably cost more than my entire vehicle, and watches that flashed beneath the entrance lights. The truth was, the only thing I could think about was the dinosaur puzzle in my trunk. I thought about Matteo. He had asked for the puzzle 3 weeks ago. I kept forgetting to bring it. That bothered me more than the suit, more than the watches, more than the cars. A man can walk into any room in any suit and be whoever he needs to be for 2 hours. But Matteo had been waiting 3 weeks for a dinosaur puzzle, and I had forgotten it twice already. That felt like the only thing that actually mattered about tonight. Matteo had asked me for one, and I still had to bring it to him. An older man was watching me, His watch alone was worth more than my entire taxi. It was Richard Edison, one of the Gala's biggest benefactors. He looked me up and down. Driver. When I finished parking, I went inside and looked for the valet stand. He didn't even wait for me to answer. I told him politely, "But I'm actually one of the guests, too." He laughed. "Of course you are." A few people nearby heard him. Several smiled, awkwardly, but Lucia didn't notice. The cameras were still focused on her. A few minutes later, I entered the ballroom, found our table, and sat beside her. But Mr. Edison wasn't finished. "I see they're seating the help at the tables now. How progressive." I felt her hand tense on the table. She opened her mouth to answer. I reached for her hand beneath the tablecloth and gently squeezed it. "Leave it," I whispered. "He's being cruel." "I know." "Still, leave it." She closed her mouth and nodded. Between us, that gesture meant much more than any argument could have. Dinner continued. A nurse walked past our table. When she saw me, she smiled as if she had known me all her life. Mr. Edison noticed. He didn't say a word. He raised his wine glass, but didn't drink. Across the room, a hospital worker still wearing his uniform waved at me with a huge smile. Mr. Edison followed him with his eyes. Then he looked back at me. His smile faded a little. A cafeteria worker came over just to say, "Thank you for last week." This time, Mr. Edison placed his glass completely down on the table. "How?" he asked slowly. "How does a taxi driver know so many people from the hospital?" I simply shrugged. "Let's just say I get around quite a bit." This time, he didn't laugh. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely confused. Then the charity made a big announcement. They were going to introduce several children who had survived cancer and honor them. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. The children entered hand in hand with their parents. Everyone applauded, then 3 of them stopped walking. Their faces lit up, and they took off running. Not toward the doctors, not toward the donors, not toward the stage. They ran. Straight toward me. "Thursday!" They surrounded me with their little arms. One little girl clung to my leg as she cried. "You came!" The entire ballroom went completely silent. Richard Edison stood frozen, his glass suspended halfway to his mouth. Among the crowd, a mother covered her mouth with both hands as she cried. Her son had let go of her hand so he could run. To me first. She didn't look upset. She looked deeply grateful. Mr. Edison remained silent. He just watched. He watched a father shake my hand as if we were lifelong friends. He watched a nurse place a hand on my shoulder for a moment, far too long, to be a simple gesture of courtesy. And he watched a child refuse to let go of my jacket sleeve, even when his own mother gently tried to pull him away. Finally, he still didn't ask any questions. He simply kept watching, like a man slowly realizing that he had misunderstood the entire situation from the very beginning. Finally, he asked quietly, "Why do they call you that?" One child answered immediately, as if it were the simplest question in the world, "Because every Thursday is ours." Then another child spoke from the back in a soft voice. "You never missed a single one. 9 years ago, I drove a father home from the hospital in my taxi. He had just lost his son. The rest of the family hadn't managed to arrive in time. The nurses had stayed beside the child until the very last moment. But throughout the entire ride, that father kept repeating one thing. I wish he could have said goodbye too. He cried the entire way home. That same night, I made myself a promise. As long as it was within my power, no child would ever feel forgotten again. Since then, every Thursday, I have gone to the pediatric, oncology unit. Nobody asked me to. There was a bald little boy named Mateo. One day he told me, "Pirates never cry, not even when they lose." From that day on, I always let him win our imaginary sword fights, so he would never have to prove it. The day he lost all his hair, I showed up with my head completely shaved. He laughed so hard he almost fell out of bed. There was a little girl named Rosa. She refused to start chemotherapy unless I read her chapter 4 from her book first. Always chapter 4. I never asked her why, just never forgot to bring the book. There was also Tomas. He taught me a card game whose rules he made up as he went along. I never won a single game, and I don't think it was ever part of his plan to let me win. I was there the day Camilla rang the little bell hanging on the wall, the one the children ring when they finish their treatment when it's finally over. The entire hallway erupted in applause. I clapped louder than anyone, but I didn't always have happy endings. There was a little girl named Emma. One Thursday, I arrived and her chair was empty. A nurse touched my arm and quietly told me, Emma passed away on Tuesday. Even so, I sat in that empty chair for a few minutes, and I left the teddy bear I had brought for her resting against her pillow. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that a nurse came to check on me. She didn't say anything. She just brought me a cup of coffee and set it on the bedside table next to the teddy bear. I pushed wheeled chairs through the hallways with children riding in them while their IV stands bounced beside them like race cars. They laughed so loudly that, even if only for a few minutes, they forgot they were in a hospital. I sat beside terrified parents in waiting rooms while machines beeped behind closed doors. I never said anything brilliant. I simply stayed there. It was the only thing I could really offer. A nurse passing by stopped and said in a quiet but firm voice, 9 years. Every single one. Mr. Edison's face changed completely at that moment. He finally understood that the man he had mocked at the entrance had given thousands of hours of his life without asking for anything in return. For 9 years. No newspaper articles, no photographs, no speeches, just one Thursday after another. One of Lucia's colleagues, a doctor sitting at the table beside us, leaned toward her and commented, "You must have raised him very well." Lucia shook her head. "I didn't raise him. I simply never got in his way." Then a nurse walked past our table and stopped. "Dr. Lucia, one of your former patients is here tonight. She's asking for you." Lucia immediately stood up. She knelt beside a child in a wheelchair who was near the stage. "And where is your elephant tonight?" she asked. The child burst out laughing and pulled out the little elephant he had hidden halfway inside his jacket pocket to show her. Lucia smiled. She leaned toward him and carefully straightened his little bow tie before standing back up. "Well, that's how she is. She's not the kind of person who stands on the sidelines watching. She's the kind who remembers." Then the foundation director took the microphone and invited me onto the stage. The children pushed me forward, laughing and gently, pulling at my hands. At first I refused. I never did any of that to end up on a stage, but eventually I walked up. I held the microphone with trembling hands. "The doctors saved their lives," I said. "I was just lucky enough to be there to see how brave they were." I paused. "The children don't remember every medicine they received, but they remember with absolute clarity who stayed beside them." The entire ballroom stood up and erupted into applause. I searched for Lucia among the crowd. I found her crying. She wasn't crying because everyone had finally discovered who I really was. She was crying because she had always known. After the gala, Mr. Edison approached me. This time we were alone. "Daniel," he said, "I owe you an apology." I shook my head. "You don't owe me one. I judged you the moment I saw you." "You only saw the taxi," I replied. "You didn't know me yet." He lowered his eyes for a few seconds, as if carefully choosing his next words. "Even so, I'd like to make up for my mistake in whatever way you think is appropriate." I didn't ask for anything for myself. Fund the playroom. I didn't ask for it to carry my name. I didn't ask for a plaque honoring me. I only thought about the children A few months later, a completely new playroom opened in the pediatric oncology unit. There were freshly painted murals, new toys, and comfortable chairs for exhausted parents. Mr. Edison personally attended the opening. There were no cameras. Mateo's little brother sat cross-legged on the new carpet, putting together a dinosaur puzzle in one corner. A mother slowly drank a cup of coffee, as if it were the first time all day she had been able to do so peacefully. In one of the new reading chairs, a father had fallen asleep while his son rested curled up beside him with a picture book in his hands. Mr. Edison crouched down so a little boy could show him how the new toy race cars worked. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand what he was investing his money in. There was no plaque with my name on it, just the way I wanted. On the drive home after the gala, Lucia remained quiet for a while, watching the city lights pass by the window. "You should have let me defend you in there," she said. "With Edison?" She smiled without taking her eyes off the window. "You already did." I didn't answer. I simply kept driving. The following Thursday, I returned to the pediatric oncology unit as always. The playroom was brighter, the toys were new, and the children's laughter was exactly the same. Nothing had changed about Thursdays, and I hoped nothing ever would. 3 children called me by a name that wasn't mine before my wife even reached the table. The man who thought I was only his driver asked me how I knew them. I told him I knew them from Thursdays. The following Thursday, Lucia reached for my hand once again. She didn't say a single word. She never needed to. She found me. She always had. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments what you'd call Daniel. And if you believe the quiet ones, the ones who show up without asking for credit, deserve to be seen, hit follow so you don't miss the next one.